Chapter 5 London Days. In May 1945, I left New York for London. Several of my friends came to wave me off at the quayside. I couldn't believe that I was really leaving them, that I was leaving the country that had been my home for 10 long years. I was too stunned for emotions to play much part in the leave-taking, and it was not until the boat had sailed out from the harbour and I saw the Statue of Liberty with her arm raised as if in a personal farewell to me, that a mist covered my eyes. You have opened my eyes to the true meaning of liberty, I thought. I shall never rest until I have carried your message to Africa. 5 days later we docked in Liverpool. I was no longer the ardent youth setting out on a strange venture, inexperienced and easily shocked by the ways of the Western world. 10 years in America had seen to that. There was still a lot to learn, however. While waiting at a Lime Street station for the London train, I decided to buy a newspaper. I went to a newsboy, and handed him the penny or 2 pence, whatever the price was, and he told me to help myself. I picked up what I took to be a single copy, and as I was walking away, the boy started running madly after me, shouting, "Hi! Stop!" I looked round, wondering whatever could be wrong with him. Then, examining my purchase, I discovered that I had taken about 10 copies of the newspaper by mistake. I had been so used to the bulky American papers that I never gave it a thought. I had forgotten the restriction of newsprint in England since the war. I explained this to the boy, but I don't suppose he could believe it, as he had probably never set eyes on any daily paper boasting of more than 10 or 12 pages. Incidents like this apart, I quickly felt at home in England. And the longer I stayed there, the more I felt how easily my roots could take a hold. Nobody bothered about what you were doing, and there was nothing to stop you from getting on your feet and denouncing the whole of the British Empire. In fact, one of my pleasures in London was to buy a copy of the Daily Worker, the only paper I really enjoyed reading, and push my way into the underground with the businessmen. There, surrounded by copies of the Times, the Daily Telegraph, and the Manchester Guardian, I used to unfold my Daily Worker as ostentatiously as I could, and then watch as pairs of eyes were suddenly focused on me. But the gaze of these bowler-hatted gentlemen was not in any way hostile, and the atmosphere was always one of mild amusement. The only person I knew of in England was George Padmore, a West Indian journalist who lived in London and was the author of several articles which had aroused my interest and sympathy. I was so impressed by his writings that I wrote a letter to him from the States introducing myself and asking whether he would be able to meet me at Euston Station when I arrived. I heard nothing from him because I had left America too soon for a reply to have reached me, so I had no idea whether he would be at the station or not. I got out of the train and searched anxiously up and down the platform. We saw each other at about the same time, and from the first moment I liked him. He did much to help me during my early days in London, and the more I knew him and talked with him, the more I respected his integrity and his knowledge of the colonial question. He took me first to the West African Students' Union hostel, where I managed to get a room. But immediately I went into the place, I knew it would not answer my purpose for long. The atmosphere was chilly and formal, and I knew my irregular hours would never be allowed there. So I at once set about looking for somewhere else to live. This was far more difficult than it might sound, for accommodation was extremely scarce in London after the war, and of course, many landladies objected to taking in collared lodgers. As one of them explained to me in an effort to apologize, "It isn't as if it was me, dearie, but I've got me other gentlemen to consider." She at least had the decency to speak her mind, but I remember walking up a street once and seeing a large notice in front of a room saying, "Vacancies." With aching feet, I hopefully walked up the small front path and rang the doorbell. Nothing happened for a few minutes, and then the door was opened just wide enough for a pair of eyes to make themselves visible. Before I could get a word out, the door was slammed in my face. Thinking that there might have been some mistake, I rang the bell again, but this time not even the eyes appeared. One day I decided to sport a bus ride. I had walked so many miles on the London pavements that my shoes were almost worn out, and in my mind I had been working out whether it was cheaper to buy a bus ticket or to pay for my shoe repairs. At all events, it was a lucky chance that directed me to the bus that morning, because as soon as I boarded it, the first person I saw was Ako Ajay, my co-worker on the African interpreter of American Days. We were both immediately pleased to run up against each other again. He told me he was busy studying law, and I told him my depressing stories about London landladies. But soon I was able to forget these dragons and to lose myself in animated discussion of our mutual experiences in America and of our plans for the future. Akko finally agreed to help me look for lodgings. I dreaded to think what the peeping eyes would have done had they seen two black faces outside the door. But in any case, room hunting was certainly a far more pleasant task with a companion. No doubt, the search was all the more difficult because I had to have something cheap. Otherwise, I suppose London landladies are as flexible as most human beings if they have a few pound notes waved in front of their faces. One day we trekked around the Tufnell Park area, and as we were walking down Burley Road, we decided to try our luck at number 60. We knocked at the door without much hope, fully prepared for it to be slammed in our faces. It was opened by a young woman who inquired very civilly what we wanted. She listened attentively to what we had to say, and then said she couldn't promise us anything definite until she had consulted her husband, but that we should return the same afternoon. We went back wondering whether this was really going to be the end of my long search, and it was. We were showed in, and I was taken to see a little room of about 10 feet square, which I was told could be all mine for 30 shillings a week without meals. I felt so happy about getting anything at all that I would have accepted it even if there had been no furniture. And this little room became my home for the whole of my stay in London from June 1945 until November 1947. The family proved extremely kind and took a great interest in my well-being. I was very rarely in before midnight, as I used to work until all hours. But whatever time I came in, I always knew that I would find something to eat left for me in the oven. In return for their kindness, I insisted that my landlady leave all the dirty dishes for me to wash. This I did regularly before I went to bed. My purpose in going to London was to study law and at the same time to complete my thesis for a doctorate in philosophy. As soon as I arrived in London, therefore, I enrolled at Gray's Inn and arranged to attend lectures at the London School of Economics. It was here that I met Professor Lasky when he lectured there on political science, a subject in which I was keenly interested. Later on, I registered in University College as well in order to read philosophy. I abandoned the research work that I had been doing in ethnophilosophy, which was the subject of my original thesis, and decided instead to work on another thesis on what was then a new theory of knowledge, logical positivism. I began this study under Professor Ayer. In spite of this, it was only a matter of weeks before I got myself tangled up with the political activities in London. As in my American days, I associated myself with all political movements and parties, and I felt that the Communist Party in England was fortunate in having among its leaders personalities such as Emil Burns, Palmer Dutt, and Harry Pollitt. The first move was to become a member of the West African Students' Union, of which I later became vice president. After much organization, the union became an effective body both in taking care of new students, especially in finding accommodation and arranging for their registration at the various inns of court or colleges, and in agitating for better conditions in West Africa by petitions to the colonial office. Sometimes students got into difficulties with the payment of fees, and the union would either write to their families asking for financial assistance, or, if this was fruitless, endeavor to find a means of helping them out from its own meager funds. Sometimes there would be disputes with landladies whom, because of their scarcity value, we had to cherish. Occasionally, someone would end up in trouble with a girl picked up in Piccadilly or the Tottenham Court Road. There was never a dull moment, and I thoroughly enjoyed the work. About a month after I arrived in London, I found myself busily engaged with George Padmore, T.R. McConan, a gifted speaker, and Peter Abrahams, the coloured South African writer, in making hurried preparations for the 5th Pan-African Congress. Which it was planned to hold in the town hall at Manchester in October that year. George Padmore and I became joint secretaries of the organisation committee, and we worked night and day in George's flat. We used to sit in a small kitchen, the wooden table completely covered by papers, a pot of tea which we always forgot until it had been made 2 or 3 hours, and George typing at his small typewriter so fast that the papers were churned out as though they were being rolled off a printing press. We dispatched hundreds and hundreds of letters to the various organizations throughout Africa and the West Indies, explaining the aims of the Congress and the political tactics that should be adopted to achieve liberation in the colonies. The Congress took place as planned in October under the joint chairmanship of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, an Afro-American scholar and one of the founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, and Dr. Peter Milliard, a Negro physician from British Guiana, practicing in Manchester. The Congress was a tremendous success and was attended by over 200 delegates from all over the world. We listened to reports of conditions in the colonial territories, and both capitalist and reformist solutions to the African colonial problems were rejected. Instead, the Congress unanimously endorsed the doctrine of African socialism based upon the tactics of positive action without violence. It also endorsed the principles enunciated in the Declaration of Human Rights and advised Africans and those of African descent, wherever they might be, to organize themselves into political parties, trade unions, cooperative societies, and farmers' organizations in support of their struggle for political freedom and economic advancement. The important declarations addressed to the imperialist powers of the world were adopted by the Congress, one written by Dr. Du Bois and the other written by myself. These declarations asserted the determination of colonial peoples to be free and condemned the monopoly of capital and the use of private wealth and industry for personal profits alone. They made a stand for economic democracy as being the only real democracy and appealed to colonial people everywhere, the intellectuals, professional classes, the workers, to awaken to their responsibilities in freeing themselves and saving the world from the clutches of imperialism. Although this conference was the 5th of its kind that had taken place, it was quite distinct and different in tone, outlook, and ideology from the 4 that had preceded it. While the 4 previous conferences were both promoted and supported mainly by middle-class intellectuals and bourgeois Negro reformists, that this 5th Pan-African Congress was attended by workers, trade unionists, farmers, cooperative societies, and by African and other college students. As the preponderance of members attending the Congress were African, its ideology became African nationalism, a revolt by African nationalism against colonialism, racialism, and imperialism in Africa, and it adopted Marxist socialism as its philosophy. But the main reason why it achieved so much was because for the first time the delegates who attended it were practical men and men of action, and not, as was the case of the 4 previous conferences, merely idealists contenting themselves with writing theses but quite unable or unwilling to take any active part in dealing with the African problem. Like Garveyism, the first 4 conferences were not born of indigenous African consciousness. Garvey's ideology was concerned with black nationalism as opposed to African nationalism. And it was this fifth Pan-African Congress that provided the outlet for African nationalism and brought about the awakening of African political consciousness. It became, in fact, a mass movement of Africa for the Africans. I had little to do with the speakers themselves at this Congress, for I was kept far too busy supervising the organization. But I remember one evening, McKernan came to see me behind the scenes in a state of great agitation. Could I possibly see a Dr. Raphael Amato? He said. Dr. Amato, a native of Togoland, had been invited to speak at the conference. He came in and declared that he had lost his portmanteau in which he had several things of value. He felt that since we had been responsible for his attendance at the conference, we should make good the loss he had sustained. He proceeded there and then to list the items and assess their value and presented me with the account. The Congress was already very much in debt, but I decided it was better to pay the man and get it over the best way we could. Later, through a Mr. Ashi Nico, who was leading a delegation of farmers to protest against the setting up of the Gold Coast Cocoa Marketing Board, we received £50 from the president of the Aborigines Rights Protection Society in the Gold Coast. Having formulated the program for Pan-African nationalism, the Congress came to end. Padmore, Abrahams and I left for London, whilst McKernan, Jomo Kenyatta, who was later held responsible for the Mau Mau movement in Kenya, and Dr. Milliard remained in Manchester to organise the Pan-African Federation there. A working committee was set up as a result of the Congress with the object of giving effect to the programme that was being drawn up. Dr. Du Bois presided over this and I was appointed General Secretary. At a meeting of the committee held in London soon after the Congress had come to an end, it was decided that the headquarters of the Pan-African Congress should be established in London to act as a kind of clearinghouse for the various political movements that would take shape in the colonies. We started looking for an office in which to set up these headquarters, but because of financial difficulties, we did not succeed. It was at this juncture that Ashi Nico, Wallace Johnson, Bankole Akpata, Aruna Renner, and Kojo Botsio approached me and suggested that we should set up a West African National Secretariat in order to put into action the new Pan-African nationalism. With particular reference to West Africa and with the object of calling a West African National Congress and of directing the program of self-government for the West African colonies, British as well as French. I was offered and accepted the secretaryship of the West African National Secretariat, and because of the demand for the West African delegates for a centre in London from which they could effectively direct their program, I set about looking for an office. Before long, I had found one, a small room in 94 Gray's Inn Road, which was at the time the office of a Gold Coast barrister, Koilabi. This little room became our headquarters, and it must have been the busiest little place of its size in the whole of London. It was rarely empty, for as soon as word went out of its whereabouts, it became the rendezvous of all African and West Indian students and their friends. It was there that we used to assemble to discuss our plans, to voice our opinions and air our grievances. As Secretary General, all the organizing of the Secretariat rested on my shoulders, and as we never had any money, this was no easy task. One of our main difficulties was the acute shortage of coal, as we were invariably in office until well after midnight in all weathers and seasons. Coal was a necessity in winter. However enthusiastic and loyal a person may be to a cause, it is almost impossible to give of your best with icicles forming at the end of your nose, with feet and hands swollen with frostbite and the electric light bulbs dimmed by the constant fog of human breath. So much of our time during the winter months was spent walking miles and miles around London in search of lumps of coal, preferably those bits surrounding a coal hole after the merchant had refilled it, or the bits that fell off coal lorries, if we were lucky enough to be the first on the scene. But even if we had difficulty in warming our bodies around a fire, our hearts were constantly warmed by the ever-ready offer of help by several English girls. These girls, most of them of good class families, used to come and type for hours on end in the evenings, and they never asked a single penny for their work. The best we could do for them was either to put them in a taxi and pay their fare, if we happened to be in funds, or which was more often the case, to accompany them to the tube station and wave them goodbye. I did one day go to the cinema with one of them. However, because I remember as we were about to go in, an Englishman made some scathing remark about the girl being in the company of a black man, only that was not the expression he used. The next thing I knew was that the girl had given him a resounding slap on the face and told him to mind his own business and not to use such offensive language. Being the cause of it all, I suggested to her that I take her home and leave her, but she insisted that we carry on. We were therefore very impressed by the English women. There was a warmth of sincerity and sympathy surrounding them. Their hearts were big, and what they did for us, they did in a quiet and unassuming way, and expected neither thanks nor reward. Within a few months of starting the West African National Secretariat, letters began to pour in from all quarters of the globe. As the volume of work increased, I realized the necessity of a newspaper as an official organ of the Secretariat in order to spread some of the ideas that we were then formulating. And so I started to make plans for the publication of a monthly paper to be called The New African. I managed to collect £50, which I deposited with the publishers, who undertook to print 3,000 copies for the first month. In March 1946, the first issue appeared, subtitled The Voice of the Awakened African, and with the motto, For Unity and Absolute Independence. Within a few hours of its appearance, the paper was completely sold out at 3p a copy. With the able assistance of a Nigerian student, Bankole Akpata, I preached through its editorial columns African unity and nationalism, and attacked imperialism and the unjust laws in the colonies. While the New African became in London the voice of the West African National Secretariat, a magazine called Pan Africa was established by Makonnen and Kenyatta in Manchester to serve as the organ of the Pan-African Federation. After a short time, however, we were forced to stop the publication of the New African owing to a lack of funds. In fact, the balance of £150 which we owed the printers was settled by me only after I had returned to the Gold Coast. Before the paper collapsed, we were able to use it in order to call the first West African Conference in London. It was in this connection, in an effort to include in the conference Africans from the French territories of West Africa, that I paid a visit to Paris. It was my first trip to the continent. I had heard much of Paris and was expecting something quite out of the ordinary. I found the city disappointing. Of course, I had not gone there with a view to enjoying myself. I had no money, and time was too precious to waste on frivolities. I went to meet the African members of the French National Assembly, Suru Apifi, Leopold Senghor, Lamine Gueye, Ufret Boigny, and others. We had long discussions and planned, among other things, a movement for the Union of West African Socialist Republics. As a result of my visit, Apiti and Senghor came to London to represent the French West Africans at the West African Conference. 2 such conferences were held, at which it was decided to endeavour to drive home as forcibly as possible the idea of West African unity and nationalism among the students and other Africans who were then studying in Europe and by America. By this time, the political conscience of African students was aroused, particularly in London, and whenever they met, they talked little else but nationalist politics and colonial liberation movements. Not long after my arrival in 1945, the Labour Party won its victory over the Conservatives in the first post-war general election. The West African Students' Union did what they could to bring about a Labour victory because they felt that this party was the most understanding and the most sympathetic towards the colonial problem. They arranged for various Labour members to give talks to students, and through that I met several prominent socialists, among them Mr. A. Creech Jones, later Secretary of State for the Colonies, and Dr. Rita Hindon, Secretary of the Fabian Society Colonial Bureau. But I regret that our hopes in the Labour Party were completely dashed to pieces. In fact, we saw little difference between Labour colonial policy and that of the Tories. Consequently, at a Labour Party meeting, Mr. Creech Jones was exposed to much heckling by colonial students who made a point of being present. Perhaps the most difficult part of the work of the West African National Secretariat was the formation of the Coloured Workers' Association of Great Britain. When I arrived in London, it was to find that the Africans and coloured workers were divided into two groups, the students on the one side and the non-students on the other. The non-students were composed mainly of seamen who had come from various African territories before and during the war and had stayed on for various reasons thereafter. They were, for the most part, unemployed and almost destitute. Our aim was to help them find a job, or, failing that, to find ways and means of getting them repatriated. The work connected with these coloured workers led me on fairly regular visits to Liverpool, Manchester and Cardiff, and one of the duties that devolved on me was to look into the living conditions of Africans in Britain. Sometimes these were so appalling that they defied description. In the East End of London, particularly, the meanest kind of African mud hut would have been a palace compared to the slum that had become their lot. However clean they tried to be, for the African is probably the most particular of any race about his cleanliness, it was impossible to eradicate the lice, the rats, and the stench of bad drainage exaggerated by the filthy living of their neighbours. Through living in such conditions, they had in many cases given up trying to lead a decent life. I used to sit and listen to their problems. Sometimes they had got in trouble with English girls, or they had gotten on the wrong side of the law for petty thieving. Several times I had to visit men who had been imprisoned in Wormwood Scrubs. The prison cells were certainly a vast improvement on what some of them had to put up with, but it was no good to have their freedom taken away from them. It was a saddening experience, but by establishing the Coloured Workers Association, an effort had been made to get something done for them. Consequently, they felt more hopeful and began to improve their conditions. And meeting them regularly, discussing with them their difficulties and trying to offer solution, went a long way to alleviate their misery. I also found that by intervening in time, it was often possible to keep disputes out of court. There were, of course, many cases of racial antagonism, where, after a few drinks had been taken on both sides, fights would begin. But I usually found that each party, after I had talked the matter over with them, was sorry for what had occurred and was ready to shake hands and forget. If such a case had been left for the police to deal with by fines or imprisonment, the bitterness would have been intensified. There was so much to be done for the coloured workers that the West African National Secretariat became centered more or less on their organization, and the West African Students' Union focused its attention on the students. But both were always, to some extent, a political clearinghouse for African affairs. It was after a mass meeting of the students and workers' organizations in Britain held in Holborn Hall that I again visited Paris. This time a proposal was made at the meeting with the African deputies of the French Assembly to hold a West African National Conference in Lagos in October 1948, to which all political organizations and popular movements in the whole of Africa should be invited. It was proposed that I should be responsible for the convening of this conference, and the plans that I laid before them for carrying this out were immediately approved. As soon as I returned to London, I set to work to set the wheels in motion. We held demonstrations and meetings in Trafalgar Square and Hyde Park. A Socialist Member of Parliament who was very often to be seen speaking for us on such occasions was Fenner Bocray. We used to collect a crowd of people who were always sympathetic, but I am convinced that they thought we were exaggerating. It was quite obvious that the average man in the street in Britain had no idea whatever of the conditions prevailing in his country's colonies. By this time, I had ceased my law studies primarily because I had no money, and also because I had become so deeply engrossed in social political activities that I had no time to do any serious study. My thesis, too, seemed destined to be an unfinished work. but at that time such matters seemed trivial compared with the need for arousing African nationalism, for only by prompt and concerted action could we ever hope to achieve even a small part of the program we had set ourselves. Indeed, I was poor. I used to frequent the lower-class restaurants in Camden Town and Tottenham Court Road, buying a cup of tea or, if finances allowed, a bun and a bread roll, and spend hours discussing politics with the various men who used to gather there. The cafe proprietors were on the whole a very decent lot, for I never remember being asked to move on. One day Padmore and I, sitting in one of these cafes discussing some problem or another, when all of a sudden I became conscious that we were being carefully scrutinized. I raised my eyes, and there, peering at us with the most profound interest, was a small girl. Suddenly she screamed with excitement as she said, "Mummy, it talks!" The poor mother was crimson with shame as she came across and tried to snatch her awkward child away, but we laughed and told her not to mind. The students who supported the West African National Secretariat organized themselves into student groups and met regularly for discussions at the headquarters. One of these groups, of which I was the chairman, became the vanguard group, and we called ourselves the Circle. Membership cost 7 guineas, and only those who were believed or known to be genuinely working for West African unity and the destruction of colonialism were admitted. The document that we drew up, giving the aims and purpose of this organization, the oath of allegiance, and the duties of Circle members, is reproduced in Appendix B of this book. Members of the Circle began to train themselves in order to be able to commence revolutionary work in any part of the African continent. They were like a special service group of the Secretariat, and it was they who directed the program and activities of the national headquarters, and took the lead in calling meetings and conferences and arranging lectures and discussions. One day I received a letter from Akko Ajay, who was then back in the Gold Coast, asking me if I would return and take on the job of General Secretary at the United Gold Coast Convention. He explained that the UGCC was being faced with the problem of how to reconcile the leadership of the intelligentsia with the broad masses of the people, and, knowing my political activities in both the United States and in England, he had recommended to the Executive Committee that I should be invited to become General Secretary. He added that the Executive Committee had offered to pay me £100 a month and to provide me with a car. The money and the car didn't interest me so much. The job of General Secretary, however, most certainly did. I saw the opportunity that I had been waiting for, the chance to return home and actively help my people by the experience I had gained in party organization abroad. It seemed too good to be true, and I decided it might be better to be a little cautious and to try and find out more about what was going on in the Gold Coast, in order to play for time until I could find out something of the real spirit, motives, and aims of those who had started this movement. I replied to Akko Ajay that I was considering the proposition. In any case, I was so actively engaged at that time in preparing for the West African National Conference, which never in fact took place, that I was hesitant about rushing off, leaving so many strings untied. It just so happened that Tony McLean, an extramural tutor of Oxford University, had recently returned to England after some months in the Gold Coast, and it was through him that I found out the exact political situation obtaining in the Gold Coast. He knew several of the promoters of the UGCC personally, and gave me his honest opinion of them. From what he told me, I concluded that the sponsors of the movement were men whose political philosophy were contrary to the political aspirations of the people of the Gold Coast. He told me, however, that one among them, namely William Ofori-Atta, appeared to him to have some idea of the political and social and economic needs of the country. This assessment of the situation forced me to the conclusion that it was quite useless to associate myself with a movement backed almost entirely by reactionaries, middle-class lawyers and merchants, for my revolutionary background and ideas would make it impossible for me to work with them. Then I received a letter from Dr. J.B. Dankwa, one of the promoters of the movement, in which he urged me to take on the job. I asked several people, for their opinions, and they all seemed unwilling to persuade me one way or the other, for it was a tricky period. It might be our beginning, but it could also be the end. Still unable to decide what to do, I called a meeting of the West African National Secretariat and put the matter before them. After much serious discussion, they decided it was perhaps best for me to accept the offer. It was rather like the dawn of action at the end of a long and intensive training. However well equipped you may feel to meet any emergency during the training period, when you are faced with the prospect of the real thing, you suddenly feel like a raw recruit again. But I was very sure of the policy that I would pursue and fully prepared to come to loggerheads with the executives of the UGCC if I found out that they were following a reactionary course. Now that the matter had been decided, I wrote and accepted the post. I also wrote another letter to Dankwa explaining that I was without funds and that I would need about £100 to cover my passage and travelling expenses. This sum was sent to me by return by George Grant, who was the president of the UGCC, and I immediately started making preparations for my departure. I had not yet completed the arrangements for the convening of the West African National Conference, and I decided that on my journey back to the Gold Coast, I would stop off at Freetown and Monrovia in order to make personal contacts in an effort to pave the way for this conference, which was scheduled to take place in Lagos in October of the following year. I called a meeting of the students and the coloured workers in order to put my plan before them and to say goodbye. There were many protests against my departure, especially from the members of the Coloured Workers Association. However, I explained to them that the time had come to start putting into practice the things that we had been planning for, and that this was the chance for which we had been waiting, and that I would neither forget them nor let them down. On the 14th of November 1947, Kojo Botio and I left London for Liverpool. At Liverpool, I unexpectedly encountered difficulties with the authorities at the dock, for unknown to me, the police had collected quite a file of information about my political activities in London. They were not at all happy about my presence at communist meetings. In the end, after lengthy questioning, they grudgingly stamped my passport and I was allowed to embark. I had the feeling that whilst they were happy to see the back of me, they were a little worried as to what I was going to get up to in the Gold Coast. I could have told them then, but they would have never understood. Botio and I stood on the deck of the motor vessel Accra and suddenly watched the shores of England recede further and further away from us. It was not a happy parting for me. I had thoroughly enjoyed my stay there and had become extraordinarily attached both to the country and the people, but much was to happen before I saw England again.